Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from our lunch, and I hope you all are ready. It is an honor for us to welcome Janet Napolitano to the 2025 Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference. Secretary Napolitano is joined on stage by Chief Judge Mary Murguia. I'm going to give you some highlights from Secretary Napolitano's career. There's much more. After graduating from the University of Virginia School of Law, she served as a law clerk for Judge Mary Schroeder. Then she practiced law at Lewis & Rocha in Phoenix, Arizona. She became partner in the year 1989. And then the year 1993 marked the onset of decades of public service in many high-profile state and federal positions. That year, President Clinton appointed her as the United States Attorney for the District of Arizona. In 1998, she was elected the Arizona Attorney General. Beginning in 2003, Secretary Napolitano began her service as Arizona's governor. She launched Judge Andy Hurwitz's judicial career, appointing him to the Supreme Court of Arizona. Then, in 2009, President Barack Obama nominated her as the United States Secretary of Homeland Security, and she held this position during President Obama's first term in office. Most recently, from 2013 to 2020, Secretary Napolitano served as the president of the University of California system. Now she is a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and she is also founder and faculty director of the Institute for Security and Governance at UC Berkeley. There might be some time at the end for Q&A, so please, if you have any questions, write them down and staff will collect them and bring them to me. But we're going to try and get as much time with her as possible. So with that, I'll turn this over to Chief Judge Mary Murguia and Secretary Napolitano.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge Liberti. Janet, we're so honored, and I'm just personally very pleased to welcome you to the 2025 Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference. Thank you for joining me in this fireside chat that's basically launching our conference here. And just in light of everything going on at this time in our circuit and in the country, couldn't think of a person who has such broad experience as was just noted in that wonderful introduction, who's had so many positions that can comment on some different aspects and challenges that are happening legally right now, and just what we're dealing with as a society and as a country. So I'm going to try to ask you a couple questions relevant to each position that you've served. See if I can get through that in the next hour. But most recently, you served as the 20th president of the University of California system, and that was from 2013 to 2020. And I guess it should be noted that during your time as UC president, you froze tuition rates for multiple years. But I just wanted to ask you generally, what is your feeling about how we educate and prepare our young people for what many feel is a very uncertain future?
Well, thanks, Mary, and it's great to see you again as well, and it's lovely to be here with so many of you. I think higher education in the United States is at an inflection point, and I think people need to recognize that although it's all called higher education, there are different elements of it. There are so-called R1 universities, that's our research universities. The University of California is a research university. That means you get a certain amount of your revenue and have a certain amount of your faculty time devoted to basic research. Then there are comprehensive universities. Those are typically four-year institutions. and bachelor's degree granting institutions. A lot of our peace officers, our teachers, nurses, et cetera, come out of comprehensive universities. In California, that would be the Cal State system. And then there are two-year schools, community colleges, but then, in addition, there are things like certificate programs, different credentialing programs, apprenticeship programs, and I think that what we really need to be focused on is what does the next generation need to prepare for this, for the future they are entering into, and what is the government's role in supporting that, making that kind of post-high school education accessible, because I think the expectation every student, every high school student needs to have is they will need education beyond high school. And so as we go through all of the tension with respect to federal funding, particularly of the R1 universities, getting a greater understanding of what they do, the students they educate, their role in the whole higher education system is going to be very important. In fact, there was a major argument in Boston today about that.
So the Academy universities have always served as a place for free speech among its tenured professors and student body. I think one question that comes to mind is what role do you think universities play in fostering ideas and speech in American society? And can you speak to some of the issues confronting the universities today in that regard?
Yeah, I must say I was glad I'd stepped down as the president of UC before last spring. It is a difficult competition between two values. Universities in the United States have a fundamental belief in academic freedom, freedom of speech, and that they are kind of a community where ideas can be fought over, can be debated, can be struggled, and where young people are getting an education in how to do that. On the other hand, universities owe their students, all their students, the ability to be protected from actions that attack them, that install fear in them, and so forth. And we saw that tension in the debates on college campuses around Israel and Gaza. And some campuses, it was very lively. Some campuses, I think, handled it well, some did not. But not to be lost in this is that if we don't have academic freedom and First Amendment freedoms on our campuses, well then where else are we going to have that? I mean, they are really set up for that. So making sure that the examination of civil rights violations on our campuses doesn't overreach and really undergird the First Amendment. That is a tension that all university leaders are confronting.
Let me turn to the time at the Department of Homeland Security. You were the third U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security ever. And in your view, what is the state of the Department of Homeland Security today? And is it accomplishing what it was originally set out and designed to accomplish?
Look, the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. It combined 23 formerly different agencies from different legacy departments. It became immediately on its formation the third largest department of the federal government, the largest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947. And it has a myriad of roles. When I took over as secretary, it was counterterrorism, it was cybersecurity, it was disaster response and recovery, it was immigration enforcement, it was border enforcement, but also citizenship services for those who were going through the citizenship process. It was transportation security. We still had a lot of threats to the U.S. aviation sector. Unfortunately, as time has gone on, particularly, I must say, in the current administration, you would think DHS was an immigration agency only. Whereas in point of fact, it was really designed to bring together different agencies and departments so that they could better connect with each other and focus on the whole myriad of security risks that the country confronts.
And so, do you think it should go back to being serving those 23 functions?
It was making a lot of progress, bringing together all that many agencies, just from a management perspective. People had different colors of uniforms. They had different kinds of paperwork. They had different hiring standards, Putting that all under one umbrella was something that Tom Ridge, the first secretary, made progress on. Michael Chertoff, the second secretary, made progress on. We made a lot of progress on. And that was really coming together. Unfortunately, and I'll just say it, under the current administration, they just have a different view of what Homeland Security is. And so all of that progress in terms of having a unified department that looks at Homeland Security from all of the myriad issues that are there has gotten lost in the shuffle.
Well, you were Secretary of DHS during the response to Hurricane Sandy in 2012.
Yeah.
And centrally involved in coordinating one of the largest federal disaster responses in U.S. history. We have a panel this week on the law of catastrophe. What, in your view, have we learned in the time since Hurricane Sandy, particularly given the recent terrible events such as the Texas flash floods that just happened? And are there any mistakes that we make and that we continue to make, or are there any positives that we respond to? Are there ways that we respond to in the most positive way? Can you just speak to the strengths and weaknesses of DHS and their response to those kind of?
Right. So Hurricane Sandy was a huge storm. It covered an area the size of Western Europe. And it was a hurricane that came right up into New York Harbor. So millions of people were affected. The power went out, the subway tunnels were flooded. It was a mess. But we could see that storm coming. It was not like a flash flood, which happened like that. I mean, we could see it coming. And so lessons learned, one is where disasters are concerned, local and state officials have the first duty. I mean, when your house is flooded, you don't immediately think to call DHS. Come on. But where the federal government comes in is when local resources cannot by themselves handle the response and the recovery. And so we had already pre-positioned hundreds of people ready to go in. We had tons of food, fresh water, ready to go in. We had already coordinated with the state and locals, both governments and nonprofits. And then we had to just deal with all of the issues that come up in a huge, complex recovery. For example, the power was out. Well, across the harbor from New York City is New Jersey. And in New Jersey, they have all these high-rises. And the high-rises have a huge elderly population who live in them, right? Well, what happens when you don't have power? You don't have elevators. You can't get up, can't get down. And so we were having to send people floor by floor, apartment by apartment to do health and wellness checks and to make sure people were okay, to bring them their medication, to make sure they had food, they had fresh water, and so forth, until we could get the power restored. One of the things we did is we called public utility companies all over the country, and we got the DOD to lend us some of their huge transport planes, their C-130s and so forth. And we took those planes out to California, for example, and loaded onto them utility crews and their trucks and equipment flew them to the Northeast United States so they could begin to reconstruct the power poles and the transmission lines and get that power going as quickly as possible. Those are things that the federal government is uniquely prepared and good at. So there are other things that we do. DHS helps communities with preparation and pre-planning, and they provide millions of grants to states and locals for that kind of preparation and training of their own disaster personnel. In fact, I think the state of Texas is the largest recipient of FEMA money of any state.
Is or was? Well, how about on the Texas floods, something you don't have a lot of notice about that that comes in as flash flood? How does DHS do in responding to those types of events?
So DHS has access to resources like trained search and rescue teams that can immediately deploy into a destroyed area, looking for survivors and looking for those who did not survive. It has lots of equipment that can be deployed in order to do that. It can help with boat rescues. When people are in a flooded area, a lot of times they're stranded on their roofs or in trees or whatever. FEMA can immediately deploy lots of resources to help with boat rescues. And also remember the Coast Guard is part of DHS, and so it also comes into play.
And the reason I asked about FEMA is or was because there's been a lot of discussion recently about I don't know if it's dismantling, but cutting back on FEMA or reorganizing FEMA. What are your thoughts and reactions to that?
I think, look, any government institution can be improved and streamlined. And I wouldn't put FEMA as an exception to that. And what people don't realize is a lot of the process that FEMA has to go through in order to, for example, approve funding for individuals for their housing is actually dictated by statute and regulation. So clearing some of that out, clarifying it, making it easier, making greater use of technology, so less paperwork, that makes total sense to me. But, and there are some states, California, Texas, Florida, big states that have lots of disasters. They have, pretty good statewide emergency services departments, but most states don't, nor can they afford to keep, say, an urban search and rescue team on staff trained all the time. That's something that a FEMA can do.
How about wildfires? Did you have much experience with respect to wildfires?
I had experience with wildfire when I was governor of Arizona. And those have become an increasing problem, probably attached to the climate change and the drought in our national forests and federal forests and so forth. But those can move very quickly too, and evacuation is always a challenge because you'll tell people to evacuate, but here's the problem: humans don't want to leave their homes. And once they've been told to evacuate once or twice, there's a little bit of, I went through the last one, it was okay. I went through the one after that, it was okay. So dealing with that human resistance to leaving their homes is always an issue.
Well, I mentioned governor of Arizona. You served as governor of Arizona from 2003 to 2009. Let me ask you, what do you see as the most important issues facing Arizona and the American Southwest over the next 10 or 20 years?
So Arizona is such a wonderful state and a rapidly changing state. But the entire Western United States is. I think major issues for Arizona will continue to be immigration and what is the right way to handle immigration and border enforcement. I think in Arizona, like other states, dealing with ultra-partisanship, split between the two parties. In Arizona, it's almost 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 R's, 1/3 D's, 1/3 independents. So that's a challenge. And then you have other pragmatic challenges. How do you educate the next generation in a state that has lots of young families? Water, and dealing with water. And, the point of fact is places like Los Angeles and Phoenix, whatever, have no reason to exist where they do. Come on. But they're there, and there are millions of people who live there. So dealing with water is going to be an ongoing issue.
And what do you think is some of the, items people who are dealing with that should keep in mind or should try to move on or highlight or emphasize with respect to the water?
Well, one of the big fights in the water issue is, the old doctrine of the water, like first in use gets precedence, right? And so agriculture generally was first in use, and agriculture uses a lot more water than residential does. And that's a tension between cities and farms, and it's a tension that I think will only continue to grow, and that's where governors really can play a role in helping to mitigate that and work out compromises.
Well, as governor, speaking of that, you served as chair of the National Governors Association. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just wanted to see if you could inform our audience here on what that association is, what functions does it serve, and I don't know if people will understand or know that, and there may be something that might surprise them regarding that organization.
So I belonged to two associations over my state political career. One was the National Association of Attorneys General, NAG, worst acronym ever, and the National Governors Association, the NGA. These are associations, they're decades old, they're set up to be nonpartisan, bipartisan, and to focus on issues that are particularly relevant to that particular office. And so like for the NGA, the chair was always of one party and the vice chair was always of another party, and then the next year it would flip, right? One of the things the NGA does is it interacts a lot in Washington, D.C., both with the executive branch and with the Congress in terms of things they're thinking about, ideas they have, et cetera, that from a governor's perspective are very impactful. Sometimes like you go, really? They're thinking of doing what? Or it's something that governors think they need from the federal government. So it becomes kind of a place where governors can come together as a unified body and interact with Washington, D.C. It also hosts wonderful conferences, wonderful speakers, and so forth, to give governors new ideas, new thoughts about things they can consider for their own states. Now there's also a Republican Governors Association and a Democratic Governors Association. Those are more political. That's about electing more Democrats as governor, more Republicans as governor. And there's the same thing in the AG world, DAGA and RAGA, the Democratic Attorneys General Association and the Republican Attorney General Association. Those were relatively, particularly DAGA and RAGA, were actually came into existence after I was Attorney General, because Attorneys General, when I was there in 1998, 2002, when I was there, viewed themselves as, we're there to enforce the rule of law, and it should be a nonpartisan thing. And so the break off into DAGA and RAGA was an evolution saying, well, we may be there to enforce the rule of law as a body, but there are partisan differences.
Well, because for most of your political career, you served in a divided government.
Yeah.
And you just spoke a little bit about it, but how did you approach working with leaders from other political parties? It seems like that's very relevant right now.
Well, when I was Attorney General and Governor of Arizona, the legislature both houses were Republican, and conservative Republican. But I just had this recognition that if I wanted to get anything done, I had to sit down with them, listen to them, and figure out where there were opportunities to work together, where there were opportunities where I could give them this if they gave me that, recognizing that sometimes they would push the envelope. I think I had something like 155 vetoes when I was governor. I was never overridden. And actually, when I became governor, I went into the office the first day, and there was an emergency budget bill that was going to get up to me that week. And I knew it was going to veto it, and they knew I was going to veto it. They were just testing. And I went in the desk to look for the veto stamp, and it was gone. And I think somebody on my predecessor's staff took it as like the greatest souvenir ever. So we had to send somebody up to Staples to get another veto stamp made. And we made it a self-inking stamp, because I figured, we're going to use this a bit. And then they would send me bills that we called them veto bait. They knew I was going to veto them, so that got added to the count. But I would veto. I was always very clear in my veto message so the people would understand why I was making this decision. And then oftentimes then we would sit down and hash out an agreement that both of us could live with.
I heard, maybe you can confirm this or not, though, that when it came down to really getting the budget set, that you met with the members of the legislature one-on-one with no staff.
Yeah, so budget negotiations are really such an important part of the legislative process. We'd go, they'd back and forth, and there'd be hearings, and there'd be staff would be interacting, whatever. But where we actually ended up getting the budget done is I would meet with the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, the three of us, and we would meet, no staff, in a room, and I knew that budget line by line, and we would just go through it line by line until we worked something out. That's probably not as democratic as one would hope in a representative government, but you got to get it done.
At DHS, and as U.S. Attorney and Governor, you were faced with some man-made or man-caused disasters that have become, I think, all too common of occurrence. And just wanted to ask, what can we as a society do to better stem the cycle of repeated domestic terror events?
Yeah, that's such a hard question, and I suspect many in this room have your own ideas. I'd be interested in them. When I became, when I was Attorney General, we had some instances in Arizona. When I was U.S. Attorney, we had Oak Bomb, the Oklahoma City bombing, and a big part of that investigation happened in Arizona because Tim McVeigh had done a lot of the planning in the Kingman area up in the northwest corner of the state. As we have seen over time, the issue between having very strongly held views and then tipping over into organized violence, we don't really have a good understanding of where that tipping point is, or why certain people seem to be more susceptible to it than others. I think in this era, I think social media doesn't help, because social media allows individuals who previously had been isolated to actually, come together and organize via social media. And that is a problem. But the prevention of domestic terrorism, it is a problem for which there is no good answer yet in the United States, nor is there a good answer anywhere in the world.
Okay.
Just cheering people up.
Okay, thank you. Trying to make a pivot here. Let's go back to immigration.
Oh, good.
Yes. Can you see a scenario where we can see meaningful immigration reform? I mean, if you could wave a magic wand, what would that look like?
Well, I actually think big parts of it had been hashed out by a bipartisan group in the Senate before the presidential election, and then it didn't make it over the through the politics of the time. But here's the basic thought I've come to believe, which is that everybody believes, and I believe strongly, in border security. I mean, it's part of our national sovereignty. And I have to say that some of the actions President Trump has taken on the border, to me, make sense. And we're seeing the impact on the numbers at the border. Interior enforcement, it turns out, is a different and much more complicated issue because you have such a variety. You have recent entrants into the United States. You have those who have committed other serious crimes. When I was secretary, we prioritized those two groups, those who were caught near the border, who had just come in, those who had committed other serious crimes. Then you have people who have been here for years. Their families are here, their children were born here. Many of them work in areas of the economy where we need their labor. Many of them have started their own businesses that pay taxes and so forth. And I think that what the people of the United States are beginning to recognize is that enforcement on the interior of the country is different than at the border. And I think what it will take to get the Congress to finally comprehensively reform our immigration laws is for those politics to change.
Well, Governor, you declared, I think, a state of emergency along the Arizona border in 2005. Mm-hmm. And that was long before it became a hot-button national issue. I was wondering if you could just comment on the state of the Arizona-Mexico border in ways that maybe folks may not appreciate. You have firsthand experience in dealing with politicians on the other side of the border and on issues directly related to the border, in addition to immigration. Is there anything you can comment on?
Yeah, for example, when I was governor, we had something called the Arizona-Mexico Commission, and we worked extensively with the state of Sonora, which is the state of Mexico that borders Arizona, on all kinds of issues. Our commission would meet twice a year, once in Arizona, once in Sonora. It was very active. We dealt with issues of water. We dealt with issues of tourism. We dealt with issues of trade. We dealt with issues of travel. Because they were our largest trading partner. I mean, and there were lots of jobs in Arizona that were dependent on the free flow of commerce across that border. In 2005, I sent our National Guard to the border to back up the Border Patrol. Why? Because through operations that the U.S. government had taken in El Paso and San Diego, the whole traffic from Mexico and points south had moved into the Arizona corridor. 60% of the Border Patrol arrests in that year came in the Tucson sector of the border. And that was not satisfying. It was scaring people. And there were some horrific issues that happened because of that. So we sent the Guard down there. And I also did one thing. Okay, so this is kind of performative politics, but it costs the state money. You have people that are in your jails and prisons and so forth who are undocumented, and so I had a great big invoice made up to bill the United States government, and I did one of these big foam board things, and I made up the invoice to send to President Bush and Secretary Chertoff about what they owed the state of Arizona. Well, they didn't respond. So a few weeks later, I did another big invoice, and then I added a late charge. It didn't, but it was there to make the point. When I was Secretary of Homeland Security, we made sure that there were adequate resources put in that sector.
I want to ask you about cybersecurity, but before I do that, I just want to ask you about DACA. At DHS, you oversaw the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program. I guess, what is your opinion on the experience of the Dreamers since that time, and do you have any comments regarding that program, reflecting back now?
So we enacted DACA because there was this group of young people who typically they were brought to the United States before they were 6 years old. They'd grown up in the United States. They really only knew the United States as home, but they were undocumented. And they called themselves, at that time, they called themselves Dreamers. But many were going to college or trying to go to college. They joined the military, they'd started families and business, whatever. So our lawyers, through our general counsel's office, developed a theory for DACA where young people could register, go through a criminal background check, pay a fee, and enroll in DACA, and then we would defer any immigration enforcement against them, and they would be able to get work authorization. The president announced it from the Rose Garden in June of 2012, and he said we were going to have it up and running by like 60 days later. Okay, so we did, and we didn't know whether we'd have 5 people register, 500, 5,000. At its peak, there were 850,000 young people, and many of them, we had several thousand at the University of California in our student body. Okay, so DACA was rolling along, it was going well, and then during Trump's first administration, he tried to rescind DACA. And by then, I was president of the University of California. So we became the first institution to sue to challenge the rescission, making me, I think, the only cabinet secretary who has ever directly sued her successor. Anyway, that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court didn't rule on the merits of could we do DACA or not, but it did rule in our favor that they had, the rescission had been done inappropriately, illegally. And so DACA survived. But then there was another case in Texas, and it put like a stay on new DACA enrollees, and that's the way it's been for a long time, which is no new enrollees, but people in the program can continue to re-enroll. It's interesting, when we did DACA, I was expecting a huge amount of controversy and attacks and being soft on immigration and all this kind of stuff. And hardly got any, because I think the American people have a sense of fundamental fairness, and that this was not a perfect solution, but it was fair given the laws that existed.
Over the years, we've heard many speakers address our audience and warning about the concerns from cybersecurity. And so I guess I'd like to hear from you about concerns about cybersecurity, how you see that, and maybe what's the greatest threat to the U.S. right now?
Yeah, so as I told you, when I started off as DHS secretary, we were still having a lot of threats against aviation. And I spent a lot of my time on that, and I spent maybe 10% on cyber issues. By the time I left as secretary, and I was there almost 5 years because I did go into the first year of Obama's second term, I was spending maybe 40% of my time on cyber. And you see it, I mean, you all are linked, you all are sharing stuff by cyber, some of it very confidential and needs to be kept confidential. It just turns out that incentivizing institutions to invest in their network security, and then training employees about what to watch out for, which needs to be persistent. You can't just do it once. It needs to be repeated and repeated and repeated, is a real challenge. We know that our adversaries, China, Russia, to name but two, are very active in kind of parking themselves in our networks, particularly where our critical infrastructure is concerned. So it remains an, cybersecurity, you heard a lot about it for a while. You haven't heard so much about it lately because everybody's talking about AI, but it remains a key security risk.
You've accomplished a lot in your career, private lawyer, prosecutor, attorney general, governor, DHS secretary, and University of California president. What was your favorite job?
Being a law clerk. No, really, I mean, I drove across to Phoenix from Charlottesville. I didn't know a soul in Phoenix. I had actually met Judge Schroeder when she was on Calendar in San Francisco for like a half-an-hour interview. And I arrived in Phoenix August the 8th, 1983, about 4 p.m. This day lives in infamy. And the waves of heat are coming across the desert floor. They're rising up. And I said to myself, oh, thank God I'm only going to be here a year. And 20 some odd years later, I was the governor. So things happen, you know?
You just mentioned Judge Schroeder, and I want to ask you about mentoring because actually, I don't know how many people here know, but for me, Janet's been a tremendous and wonderful, very supportive mentor. I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office when Janet became U.S. Attorney, and she promoted me to be a section chief in charge of the violent crime. And actually, that's when Oklahoma bombing happened. And after that, just because she mentioned that, I'll tell you, we became the violent crime and terrorism section because there was so much. Timothy McVeigh was on his way to Kingman, Arizona, when he was stopped for not having a license plate on his car after having committed that most atrocious act. And Janet's been very supportive of me since then. But let me ask you about, a lot of people here mentor and have been mentored. Can you tell us about some of your mentors and how they helped shape your career? I know you mentioned Judge Schroeder.
Yeah, Judge Schroeder was a key mentor of mine, and I still talk to her all the time. She's kind of migrated from mentor to friend as those things happen. But she really helped me get started. And then when I joined Lewis and Rocha, I worked for a lawyer named John Frank. I think there's the John Frank Award here. And I was assigned to be his associate. And that turned out to be a wonderful relationship because I was doing all the associate things, research and writing and stuff like that. But he also made sure I got into court, I did my own depositions, I met with clients, and then when he learned that I had an interest in public service and in politics, he started introducing me around to other members of the Arizona Democratic Party, which at the time was fairly small. But it was a great example of what a senior partner can do for a young lawyer to make sure that they're really gaining the skills they need to be a practitioner.
And so what's the best piece of advice that you've gotten, either from a mentor or otherwise?
The one piece of advice I keep telling myself I got from my dad, and it's like, life's hard, wear a helmet. It is, and I do, so.
Okay. So lawyers are facing, a changing job market and disrupted sort of legal profession right now. Training opportunities are under potential threat from technologies.
Yeah, for sure.
How can we make sure that we are continuing to train good lawyers to navigate the legal system and to make sure everyone thrives within our system?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is AI is going to have a big impact on the legal profession, particularly in the non-litigation aspects of it. I think that litigation itself, the being in court, argument and so forth, that's still going to be an intensely human activity. But nonetheless, one of the risks of AI is that it begins to take the place of beginning lawyers in terms of research and writing initial motions and things of that sort. And if you don't learn how to do that as a young lawyer, well, what do you do 10 years later? I think watching out for AI's infiltration into legal filings and so forth is something that is going to be important. And then for the law firm partners in the audience and for the judges in the audience, law firm partners, you have associates, judges, you have law clerks. You don't have to be a mentor to all of them, but to think of and try to envision yourself being a mentor to one or two can really change people's lives, change mine.
Seems like politics and government has changed since your first run in 1998. Would you encourage a young person to run for political office now? Is there anything you would do to encourage young people to go into politics and government right now?
It's tough. I've actually thought about this question a lot because when I stepped down as U.S. Attorney to run for Attorney General, I mean, it was 1998. It was, people didn't have smartphones. You didn't have social media. You didn't have the kind of money that now is flowing into our politics. And those have made the practice of politics much more difficult, and for many have been a real deterrent to going into politics. But the reason to go into politics is that in our system, the ability to get big things done still rests on who is in elected office. You're frustrated with your local schools, run for the school board. You don't like the way traffic is managed in your city, run for the city council. You think your state should have a more robust economic future, run for state office. You think the rule of law is really important and there are things that need to be done to vindicate the rule of law, run for attorney general or district attorney. But there's something about holding that elected label that makes a huge difference. So, for every individual, it's a very personal choice. It was a hard choice for me to leave the U.S. Attorney's Office to run, but I'm glad I did. It's just that I think it's an even more difficult decision to make now. But you still ought to think about it and do it.
You've really earned the luxury of sitting back and enjoying the fruits of a truly extraordinary career. So how do you spend your time after stepping down from the presidency of the University of California and to join the faculty at Berkeley? What do you do now?
So I teach security policy. I just taught a class on the U.S. intelligence and national security. I run an institute on security and governance where we work a lot with the private sector and academia and government agencies to identify concrete, tangible problems that they have and how we can bring together the brains of academia, the financial wherewithal of the private sector, and a real focus on what government security agencies need help on. And I serve on some boards and stuff. I was on President Biden's Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board, which was monthly trips to D.C. During his term. And I was on a special independent panel to investigate the assassination attempt of July 13 last year.
President Trump?
Of President Trump, and spent 60 days heavily involved in that investigation. So there's always something useful to do, one hopes.
I have another question, but I've gotten a couple of questions from the audience. One is, what are your thoughts on sanctuary cities or sanctuary states?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, actually. I do think the labeling is unfortunate because, in point of fact, states and cities labeled as sanctuary are not pure sanctuaries. For example, in California, in terms of cooperation between those held in jails and prisons and ICE, there is an exception for those who are being detained or for having committed a serious crime, so that they don't get, when they're released out into the public, but get turned over for whatever immigration action is appropriate. So I think the labeling is unfortunate. I do believe that what we're seeing now is actually an overreaction to that from the enforcement side. And I do believe, and I say this, I worked a lot with our ICE agents and our Border Patrol agents and so forth, and respect the work they do, but the work they do needs to be carefully calibrated to the problem they are there to deal with, and it needs to be highly professional. And I have grave concern that they have, those kinds of guardrails have been taken off.
Well, another question, and I know that you, as governor, you appointed a large number of folks to the judiciary in Arizona. And so one question here is, what are some qualities that you considered when appointing judges?
So Arizona had a system where for the two big urban counties, Maricopa and Pima, which is 80% of the population of the state, there was a judicial appointments commission. And for every vacancy, they had to give you 3 to 5 nominees, and they could not all be of one party. And we had a lot, and then we had the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, and there were vacancies on each of those. But it started with kind of a merit selection process in which the bar was heavily involved, and I think that was a good way to do it. I looked at, obviously you look at the resume. Obviously, if it's somebody, you look at previous writings, and to try to glean what kind of a judge they would be. You would pay attention, I would pay attention to recommendations or thoughts of people who had worked with that individual. And then I would also do a personal interview. And sometimes after the personal interview, I would have questions, and then I'd send my general counsel out to ferret out answers to those questions. But it's really one of the more important things one does as a governor, is appoint the bench. And so you want to take good care in doing that.
And so did you try to shape the judiciary in any particular manner?
I just wanted really good lawyers. I wanted the sharpest people that I could find who I thought would exercise good judgment.
Another question from the audience. Are you concerned about growing tuitions and the impact on access to education?
Yeah, tuition's always an issue, and a couple of things. First of all, where tuition is concerned, there's a difference between public universities and private universities. So public universities, like the University of California, you have basically two sources of revenue to run the place. You have whatever the state gives you, state appropriations, and then you have tuition. And there's enormous pressure to keep tuition down or flat because of the access issues. We did a couple of things. One is we managed to keep in-state tuition flat during my 7 years as president, but we raised out-of-state and international tuition quite a bit to help compensate for that. The second thing is that we dedicated that a certain percentage of tuition revenue would go right back into financial aid for students. So that, for example, an undergrad at the University of California, if you came from a family that made less than $80,000 a year, you paid no tuition. And that was working pretty well. But the upward pressure on higher ed funding is there because it's a personnel-driven system. And, you know, the personnel you have, you know, they want raises too. So that's a feature. And then, you know, during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, most states cut their allocation for higher ed by a lot. In California, they cut it almost 40%. So the university had to confront the issue, well, do we close down campuses? Do we eliminate programs, even successful ones, et cetera? What do we need to do? And this was right before I became president, and the end result was they increased tuition, and that, in effect, became the new base. Until we find a better way to finance higher education, I think tuition will remain an accessibility problem.
Before I ask this next question, I want to preface it with a little story because Janet and I were on an airplane. I was working for her as the U.S. attorney, and we were on some work-related trip, and we were on an airplane, and we happened to sit next to each other. I'm sure that was suboptimal for Janet, but you know, we were both working for a while, and she said, "I'm going to read. I'm done, and so I'm going to read for fun." Okay, I'm like, me too. I'm put my work away. So I pulled out my People magazine. Okay, Janet pulled out Roman history 500 BC. So I kind of just put away my People magazine and said, "I'm going to work a little bit more." But I'm going to ask you, what are you reading?
So I always have a nonfiction and a fiction going at the same time. So right now I'm working my way through a biography of Abraham Lincoln by David Donald, which is a classic biography of Lincoln, wonderful book, and a novel called The Expats by Chris Pavone, which is a really good spy novel. And I recommend both of them. And they're both available in paperback from Amazon.
So my last question to you is, I mean, again, quite a remarkable career, Janet, what you've done, what you've been able to accomplish, and lives that you've affected, how you've affected the public in such a significant manner for the better, in my view. Is there any one achievement that you would point to that you're most proud of, or maybe top two? Is there anything that you think, wow, I'm so glad I did this, or you stand behind?
Well, I'm glad I supported you. That's turned out pretty well.
I did not plant that question.
I'm glad I appointed Andy Hurwitz to the Arizona Supreme Court after he cleaned my clock in an argument we had at the U.S. Supreme Court, so that worked out well. No, I can't. Look, we're still going. I mean, I think the important thing is just to keep moving forward, whatever you can do, and not. focus too much on what you've already done, but keep thinking about, well, what am I going to do tomorrow, and what am I going to do next month, what am I going to do next year, and just keep that future focus. That's the way I like to do it.
Thank you. I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to come and speak to our audience and launch our conference here, and really appreciate all that you've done for the state of Arizona, for the circuit, and really for the country. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.